Hi everybody. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to say welcome to everybody to a Media at Sydney event, Kuzo Zampala to friends from Bhutan, and hello to Wikipedians worldwide. So today I'm going to be talking about my new research project. In 2016, the United Nations declared internet access to be a human right, on par with clean water, electricity, shelter and food. They made bridging the digital divide a priority, and by the end of last year, 53.6% of the world had internet access. Now that's great news, but as the world increasingly moves online, it raises important questions about what they find there. Whose knowledge is migrating online? Whose knowledge isn't? And who are the gatekeepers in this new forum? The institutions of knowledge that are emerging are becoming increasingly significant sites of cultural power, and Wikipedia is perhaps the most prominent example. The Bhutan-Wiki Project seeks to assess and address the challenges associated with English Wikipedia as a global institution of power. It has three research aims, and today I'm going to talk about the first two: the impact of English Wikipedia on global knowledge diversity, and the potential of smaller language Wikipedias to act as a cultural bulwark. Wikipedia launched in 2001 as an online platform seeking to amass all human knowledge. The intellectual wealth of the world would be freely shared, dissolving knowledge hierarchies that resulted from education, economics, culture and geography. It was a noble vision. And English Wikipedia is undoubtedly an internet success story. It's number 13 on Alexa's top global sites. It's the only not-for-profit site in the top 50, run entirely by volunteer labour, donating their time and intellectual capital for a public benefit. More than 6 million articles have been collaboratively written, and the world visited over 120 billion times last year. It is an extraordinary public resource. Google ontologist Denny Vradicek called it a wonder of the modern world, and it is. And to give you a very current example, during the first few months of the COVID-19 pandemic, over 5,200 new Wikipedia pages were created in multiple languages, covering a variety of pandemic angles. Doctors and medical specialists worked alongside non-medical people, all volunteers, to provide information that is accurate, up-to-date, and accessible to everybody. It's clear that English Wikipedia well serves English-speaking communities. However, such huge success also brings responsibilities. Its global dominance means its influence extends into other cultures. So just to give you an idea of size, this is size by number of articles. You can see English dominates. German is the second highest. I've excluded from this gap Swedish and Philippines Wikipedias because they're a little more controversial to do with the way they've been written with so much significant bot input rather than, anyway. So this is what that looks like. To show you how various smaller languages compare, this is English and some Indian language Wikipedias. Wikipedia emerged out of hacker culture, and the power hierarchy that is involved inside the English site shows that editors with administration powers are most likely to be white, male, under 30, white collar, Christian and computer savvy. Less represented are women, minority groups, and countries in the global south. This is well documented and being addressed in a number of ways by the Wikimedia Foundation and various Wikipedia communities. Its publishing practices reflect its roots as an encyclopedia. It operates according to these three pillars, and these pillars reflect a print orientation, so only content already published by reliable sources. However, this ignores the unequal power relations that produce that content and transfers existing systemic inequities to the online world. It also privileges print-based knowledge systems over others, such as those of oral cultures. The world has nearly 7,000 languages, and only about 7% of them have been written down. Notability, again, transfers existing systemic inequities online. In practice, notability is judged according to the interests of the narrow cohort of people with power on the site. And many examples have been reported in mainstream media, such as the physicist Donna Strickland, who was considered not notable right up to the moment she won the Nobel Prize. The last descendant of the Indian Cherokees Blue People clan was considered so important by the Cherokee Nation that they published a book about her life, but she was deemed to lack notability by administrators on English Wikipedia, who deleted her page. As internet researcher Ethan Zuckerman asked, what happens when we share a language but not a culture? These tensions are also evident on other colonialist language Wikipedias, such as French, Spanish and Portuguese, where the colonising country's viewpoint dominates the smaller one. Wikipedia emerged out of Western media practices and reflects Enlightenment thinking with its emphasis on scientific or objective knowledge and rejection of other epistemological positions. It also reflects a universalist view of knowledge, which assumes that an objective truth exists and can be arrived at collectively, rather than situating all knowledge as a socio-historical construction that is culturally bound. Finally, the Wikipedia publishing protocols favour or equalise the amateur and the specialist. The Wikipedia ethos that anyone can edit and everyone is equal serves to equalise the amateur and the specialist. In practice, this means that a doctor has no greater authority over the content of a COVID page than an editor with no medical experience. The qualities that are valued in this environment are not direct knowledge or experience, but curation and literary skills. Now, the point here is not to undervalue those skills. On the contrary, the result is credible, well-referenced information on almost every conceivable topic, from biology to physics, medicine, history, pop culture, and breaking news. But my concern is when this equalisation also removes cultural authority. That is, the right of a community to represent, reflect, and reinforce what it holds to be culturally significant. Instead, the editors on English Wikipedia are privileged in creating the cultural narrative of every culture. This can be best seen in the geolinguistic mapping by the Oxford Institute of the Internet, which shows that Wikipedians in the global north write most of the content about the global south. Mark Graham and Martin Dittus show how many of the contributions to local content in each country has been contributed by people who are based in the same country. And we can see that to a significant degree, American and European countries, and Australia, are telling their own stories. But the same is not the case for significant large sections of the rest of the world. This becomes the problem of cultural dilution, when those same pages are presented back to that culture. For example, in Bhutan, English Wikipedia is the 8th most visited website. Few Bhutanese publish on the English website. So mostly the pages are written by outsiders referencing English sources. This means Bhutanese are reading about their country as defined by travel writers and foreign journalists. Now, on one hand, these print-based principles have provided an effective framework to reject propaganda, self-interest and misinformation, which has been instrumental in establishing Wikipedia's credibility. However, they also reinforce Western knowledge practices and ways of viewing the world. This makes English Wikipedia a new site for colonialism. In a recent public talk, renowned Bhutanese leader Songtse Khyentse Rinpoche spoke of his concerns that the slow creep of English, with its roots in Abrahamic traditions, was eroding Bhutanese ways of thinking. However, Wikipedia can be considered as a pharmacon. That is, it offers both problem and solution, limitations and possibilities. These Wikipedias that serve smaller language communities offer a counterpoint, a space where a culture can present its own version of itself back to its own community, reflecting and reinforcing what it considers to be culturally significant. They also offer new opportunities of inclusion for refugees, diasporas, and communities that exist across geopolitical borders to continue to participate in their national imagining. Bhutan provides an ideal case to consider the Wikipedia platform because its population is small, just 741,672, and as a traditionally oral culture, it has embraced digital media. It was the last country in the world to get television, and in the decades since, the nation has leapfrogged over centuries of media evolution, bypassing print capitalism, to create a dynamic media landscape dominated by digital platforms. Newspapers have low penetration, while Facebook and phone apps WeChat and WhatsApp well serve its orality. The country recognises 19 languages, and the king chose Dzongkha, naturally spoken by a quarter of the country, as the national language. It is an ongoing, unifying project for all citizens to become fluent. A Dzongkha edition of Wikipedia was launched in 2008 by Chris Finn and others, with 219 stubs or starter pages. But they've not been further developed, and the site remains largely unvisited. So this project seeks to address that. The Bhutan-Wiki Project has been designed using the framework of ethnographic action research, a participatory methodology that combines research with project development, as pioneered by Joe Tashi and others. It emphasises community partnerships, engagement, and empowerment. It was specifically designed to be adaptive, responding to the needs of the local community as defined by them. The design of this project has emerged from 2 scoping trips to Bhutan in June 2018 and January 2019, extensive consultation with stakeholders, and inclusion of a series of research partners. I also presented this project at the annual Wikimania conference held in Cape Town last year, gaining the support of Wikipedia chapters in India and Australia, the research friends. In January 2019, the Bhutan Media Foundation hosted a training pilot, partly funded by Wikimedia Foundation, with 11 Dzongkha journalists and editors. They came from Bhutan Broadcasting Service, the national newspaper Kunsul, which publishes in English and Dzongkha, Bhutan Today, a small private newspaper that publishes in English and Dzongkha, and the rest from Dzongkha-only publications. The participants ranged from senior editors to young journalism graduates. BMF brought in laptops and computers for the day, but unfortunately not all worked, which turned out to be an advantage. Instead, participants formed into groups and pairs and were able to collaborate on the English. It also made it a very sociable, collegial event. As journalists, they well understand the 3 pillars of Wikipedia. They reflect familiar journalistic norms. And feedback from this training pilot provided a template for how the project would be designed. So the Bhutan-Wiki Project will create a series of inclusive editing circles to train specific groups to publish on English Wikipedia. They are teachers, journalists, historians, monks, and bloggers, as well as retired civil servants in 2 regional hubs. We'll provide training in the publishing protocols of English Wikipedia, and while this will help improve articles about Bhutan on English Wikipedia, the greater intention is to empower the Bhutanese to develop the Dzongkha site according to their needs. Each language Wikipedia creates its own rules, so once the Bhutanese are familiar with the protocols of the English site and its practices, for ensuring credibility, they can create publishing practices and rules that serve their cultural values And this will build on work already done by colleagues who have trialled oral citations among communities in Africa and in India. The dominance of text on most English Wikipedia pages reflects the West's print orientation rather than the site's technological capabilities. It's a multimedia platform that uses audio and video. So our training will include workshops on recording audio and video on a mobile phone and how to upload them to Wikimedia Commons. Each editing circle will have a Facebook page and a WhatsApp group for discussion and support from members of the international Wikipedia community, as well as to create social spaces. The circles that we create are not intended to be closed, but to evolve over time, creating an ever-expanding network of editors meeting online around subjects of shared interest and part of the long-term sustainability that will continue beyond this project. So I'd like to just show you what I think will be quite exciting, part of what I think could be fabulous. So each Wikipedia page has a talk page behind it. This is Paro Tuksang, and where you see that it says talk, and this is where it's like a public forum, a virtual forum where people can discuss the content of the page and its meaning and collaboratively come up with a single narrative that they all contribute to and that is never finished. So it's an ongoing project. This is accessible to anybody online and international students. So the project was awarded funding by the Australian Research Council in November 2019, and training was due to start in March 2020, and then COVID. Haha. So at the moment, we've suspended the training, but we're considering other ways to go about it. So there's many Bhutanese students in Australia, and I'm hoping that we can start with them and perhaps create some international student circles as a starting point before we're able to travel to Bhutan. The cultural imperialism of English Wikipedia presents a challenge which can be countered in very specific ways by Wikipedias written by and for smaller language communities. The smaller the community, the less cultural interference. The site can act as a cultural bulwark, providing asynchronous online meeting places where communities can privilege their own knowledge practices in ways that weren't possible before the internet and Web 2 technologies. And ultimately, that's what I want this project to explore, to find new ways of inclusion and new methods of participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bunty. We have a question. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Go ahead, Margaret.
I was wondering that when people use a different orthography, it really compresses yet again, you know, the people who can contribute. I mean, even for example, when you're putting labels up in Wikidata, I can put up labels for every plant or animal because the scientific names are the same, whether you're speaking Galician, Portuguese, whatever. Obviously, I can't do that when the orthography differs. I can't even put a label up on Wikidata to show that it's the same thing. And I'm just wondering, I mean, it makes it very hard to sort of contribute. And I'm assuming that most of your people are, you know, both speak English and speak Zonka. And yeah, it just means that it is even more limited in who can contribute. I mean, even contributing photographs, you can't necessarily, I mean, if they've managed to find a Wikidata item and there's a Zonka item up there that matches it, then you can contribute a photograph, even if you don't speak the language. So I contribute lots of photographs on, you know, hundreds of Wikipedias actually. But I can't do that as easily when the language has a different orthography. Well, I mean, obviously that's how they speak it, but it's I mean, what they do. But
I do understand what you're asking, Margaret. I think that English Wikipedia won't change, obviously. And my role as researcher here is to observe how they solve all of these kinds of issues that come up when there's different languages, different, all of it. So because Zonka Wikipedia is so underutilised, and because Bhutanese are so digitally progressive and keen to embrace it, and they will do it differently. What that looks like, I don't know, but that's the exciting part of the research.
Well, it would make sense, in fact, to sort of somehow join some of you people up to people on Wikidata so that the common items are common.
Yes.
And so they can exploit things that are available through that non-language interface where things are identified solely by a number and somebody works out whether or not this matches a concept. You know, obviously there's no problem with Russian or Chinese. There's a million, millions of Chinese happily converting stuff to match so that things don't necessarily go unlabeled. But I was interested, I was pulling up some biologists, and there were a lot of Chinese biologists who didn't have any English orthography matching their Chinese names. It wasn't a huge problem in some respects because there's most Chinese names have, that English version that you can put up of their name, and so it was easier, and so I just started to put up some names in English. But
yep, no, I understand.
All of those things that are unlabeled, it's really it's one of the useful things that people can do, add labels in Wikidata. That sounds really trivial.
We'll get to Wikidata, we'll start with Wikipedia.
Well, I don't think you should.
I know, we'll have this conversation later.
No, that's why I'm bringing it up, because I think it's just as important, because it is such a lovely cross-cultural platform.
Mm.
And
I think while Bunty's fieldwork has been stalled for now, I think it's, I don't know, as an ethnographer, I would love to see, just what your interviews and what your data collection, when it can get off the ground, what it says about one phenomenon first before sort of moving into the other areas, which are definitely important. I've just noticed a couple of questions in the chat. So I'm sorry to cut you off, Margaret, but I'm just going to scroll up and see who else has a question to ask. Is White Ghost there? White Ghost has asked, how big is the Australian Bhutanese community?
Well, surprisingly, there's about 3,000 in Perth. This was pre-COVID, but not all went home. Some did, so I don't know. And not quite as large, but still large in Canberra. So I think that's two sites that could be fabulous. So once, the interborders it's all a bit more free and open, we'll start.
And is Marin Morrison there? Marin has asked, Bunty, would it work as a tool for small Indigenous language groups?
Most definitely, and I think that's partly why, well, that was partly my argument to the Australian Research Council, was how this has application for Australian Indigenous groups. And we had a conference at University of Sydney last year with Wikipedians and with people doing research in Wikipedia. And this most fantastic presentation came from a group in Western Australia who are in the process of building Noongar Wikipedia. And it's still in incubation stage within the whole Wikimedia world. And it's fantastic. And they went out into schools and they're getting recordings of the languages, and it's wonderful. The Noongar, that first step. Yes, undoubtedly, huge application.
Did you say about 3,000?
Mm. Yes.
Quite a lot, isn't it?
Yes.
Are they here permanently?
Yes, well, no, they're here studying. We have massive, massive numbers of international students from Bhutan, mainly not so many in Sydney, which is unfortunate because Sydney's so expensive, but Canberra and Perth, huge.
Oh, okay, that's the answer, that's the question. That's really interesting, thanks.
Excellent. So, Rajiv, I can do these, Jelena, I've just realised where they are.
Okay, all right.
Rajiv, how did you start that with? There isn't a wiki community already there. That's what I'm trying to build. But there are individual Wikipedians, and because, as you know, as a Wikipedian, you're not always identified, but I've tried to contact those that I've been able to figure out who they are, and they're enthusiastic, and so it's all part of creating this sort of ever-growing circles. Sharon Smith, talk function on Wikipedia, especially for diaspora groups. Are there any security concerns though with it? I know what you're asking, because of refugee groups and whatever. And I'm not suggesting that is a space for that kind of, it's not that kind of forum. It's more for, you know, creating single narrative about a country on any topic requires input and wrestling and collaboration to come up with just one single story, one single article. And in that way, people are contributing and working together. So that's what I mean by they can contribute even as they're dislocated physically from their home. They can still contribute to that national imagining, that social imaginary that is nationhood. Beata, my question, who has authored all the articles about Bhutan on English Wiki? Really good question. So in 2016, I think, no, maybe more later than that, about 2014, Wikimedia Foundation sponsored and funded and collaborated to create a whole lot of projects to increase representation in certain areas. And part of this was Bhutan pages. And there was about a dozen people who were really enthusiastic, mostly not Bhutanese, but they were keen to contribute. And then that sort of ground to a halt. Each Wikipedia page doesn't have an author as such. Yeah. It's an open document that is never complete. So everybody can contribute. And looking at the pages, there are a couple of key people. Mostly the pages about Bhutan on English Wikipedia are written by Russians, Nepalese, Indians, and then people from the West.
Thank you.
Actually, how does the chat work? Who edits the voice recordings? So the way that those talk pages work is you just come on and talk. No one edits it. It's an open forum like any online forum, just for discussion. Who edits the voice recordings? Now, these are the questions that I'm hoping to answer in the research. What are the best practices? I can see a whole lot of limitations about here's a page and you can upload anything to it. Clearly that's not going to work. But those editing practices, those administration and who decides, that's what's going to come out of the Zonka website. How they do that is going to be part of my ethnographic data, how they negotiate those roles. Fiona Martin, how do you prevent the Bhutanese project from being captured by a small group of enthusiasts who might, even inadvertently, deter newbies from getting involved? Now, there's a whole lot of aspects to that question. Really, honestly, the way that Wikipedia, English Wikipedia works is it's robust, it's messy, it's chaotic. God knows how it works, but it does. And that is just an extraordinary feat in itself. I think a Google ontologist, Denny Vradicic, Google ontologist, that's his job role, he declared English Wikipedia a modern wonder, wonder of the modern world. And it is, it's such a behemoth and it's so huge that you can look at it from so many different angles. So the power structures that emerged within English Wikipedia are quite culturally specific to English Wikipedia. There is no reason to see why Zonka Wikipedia, which will go the same path. So the Bhutanese community and society will decide the cultural practices and whether they're friendly, robust, argumentative, how that all works. They'll figure that out themselves and deter newbies from getting involved. One of the things that I think you're rightly concerned about is how does it sort of work? How will there be any kind of sort of structure around it? Well, number one, there isn't. But what has been trialled in South Africa by Heather Ford, who's here, what she trialled was having local elders as authorities, cultural authorities, and they worked with researchers from the UK to ensure that it was credible what was going on to Wikipedia. So because, you know, on English Wikipedia, the practices are all to do with print, we've got good references, it's been recognised here, they're independent sources. Those are English Wikipedia practices that come out of print, but there's a whole lot of other ways that can be done. And that's what the Zonka site can do and what I can report back. That's useful data. Rebecca Yohinki, excellent question. Yes, because clearly English Wikipedia is severely male dominated, both in terms of the topics it covers, the profiles of women are significantly less, and editors are significantly less, and the robust nature of debate on Wikipedia can be really alienating and it can be difficult. The gender bias, will that be replicated on Zonka Wikipedia? In the discussions and the collaboration with Royal University of Bhutan, we discussed this at great length, and there is the intention that for every training group, there will be equal gender. It's not really such a problem. It's not a cultural problem. I'm not treading on any, that's not a contested issue in Bhutan. Perfectly valid. That's part of their worldview.
Bunty, there's a couple of questions higher up in the chat. So UN Poo has asked, can we do something to encourage Bhutanese use of Wikipedia, like supporting internet infrastructure construction in Bhutan? And then Rajiv has a question after Fiona's further down the chat.
Bhutan has connectivity issues for the internet in Thimphu, which is why Rajiv's asking us to turn it off, because that becomes difficult for being able to participate in Zoom. But all of this is part of their ongoing vision, and the new government that's there now, part of their platform was increasing connectivity, including at, you know, Wi-Fi at bus stations and so on. So it's still got some way to go, but it's definitely on the agenda and it's definitely a priority. Somewhat, you know, COVID hasn't helped, but it's part of the ongoing progress for the country. And what that means is that remote schools will have access to the internet and access to Wikipedia English and Zonka as a teaching resource. In a country that has an oral tradition, printed materials, you know, are not so readily available and certainly not distributed to remote communities, whereas it's a lot easier to get the internet. Now, there's also actually another aspect of English Wikipedia, which is where the Wikimedia Foundation has made available, I've forgotten what it's called, Quickie with a K, and you can download information onto to USBs or CDs and take them into classrooms. So teachers can go to where they get an internet connection and produce out of that all the materials they might need for teaching. So as a resource, both the English and the Zonka sites could be very valuable for remote communities with an internet connection and not so much materials. Beata, yes. What about the different ethnicities in Bhutan, which, as you know, are of equal standing? So this also this is part of number 3, research question number 3. So Bhutan has 19 languages and Zonka has been chosen. The other languages are all oral with no written form. So they're either, you know, have an approximation using English script, Zonka script, Tibetan script, Hindi, whatever. So that poses a challenge. Oh, yeah. So the way that the Bhutanese community addressed this is definitely part of the research, because the Zonka Wikipedia, take a page on a sacred site like Taksang. Actually, take another one, Membatso, a sacred lake in Bhutan. You can have, there's a page on English Wikipedia which explains it to a Western audience, all good. But what a Bhutanese page could look like is that it would have an explanation about the lake, its history. You could have audio recordings of various language groups talking about it, oral histories, all recorded on that page. You could have videos of the walking through the site and so on. It could be a multimedia platform on that page that encompasses all of the Bhutanese languages. There's templates for English Wikipedia that could be modified for a Zonka Wikipedia that allows them to incorporate the other languages.
Bunty, there's one from Rajiv further up in the chat. How did you start the dialogue of starting the project with the Bhutanese counterparts? Is there any wiki community already there?
So how I started the dialogue, I had already done work and research in Bhutan before. So what I did was this scoping trip where I went to all the various organisations that I thought may be interested, to explain to them, to try and pitch to them basically, here's this idea, here's what English Wikipedia does, here's how you could be using it. And initially, for me, it was all about English Wikipedia, this is what it offers. But then as I became familiar with the Zonka Wikipedia and I looked at it and I talked to lots of stakeholders all throughout Bhutan, it was with that input that this started to develop and the benefits of the Zonka site became clear. So that's how it evolved. And no, there isn't a Wikipedia community, but there are individuals. Watch this space. There will be a Wikipedia community.
Margaret has asked you to comment on Wikipedia authority structures. English Wikipedia, specifically English Wikipedia authority structures. Vietnamese also has specific authority structures. Can you comment on Bhutanese Wikipedia structures yet? Authority structures yet?
They're not there yet. And when they are, I will report back. That will be part of the data I'll be collecting. How they go about this organisational structures, because they're coming from a different point. So the way that the Bhutanese have adopted like Facebook and WhatsApp and newspapers, the way they have adopted modern media platforms is quite culturally specific. So I would expect that the way that they set up Zonka Wikipedia will be the same. It'll be different. I don't know how. Sharon's question is an extension of Margaret's point. Who decides who the cultural authorities are that contribute? I won't speak for Sharon, but my addition to that is, can you say something about Wikipedia cultural authorities, not versus, but as an extension of the cultural authorities of the constructions of knowledge and disseminating knowledge that you've observed so far? So Wikipedia doesn't really, this level equality, equalising means that anyone can edit on English Wikipedia. Then there's all these power structures that go on within it, but the power structure so the cultural authority within the Zonka Wikipedia is for them to work out. Now, what I did do when I first started talking to people was I spoke to some senior people, like a man called Dasho Sonam Kinga, who was on the National Congress, Beata will know. I spoke to Mainak Tulku Rinpoche, who used to run the museum, no, the National Library. And I spoke to all these kind of respected leaders within the community about how might this work. And because of the work that Heather Ford had done in South Africa, I thought that this model could work, that there was, particularly because Zonka itself is still a contested language within Zonka speakers. They're still arguing over how it's written and how it works within the country. So the idea was that these people would be trained, learn, and provide some kind of overview. There are about half a dozen really respected scholars in Bhutan that do have cultural authority over everything. And I've talked to most of them and they're all enthusiastic. So it would be for them to do.
Penny has asked, where 47% of the population is illiterate, is wiki work capturing modern Bhutan, even though there is an interest in traditional language and culture?
Yeah, look, this is part of my third question, the research question about literacy, orality and digitality. And when we talk about literacy, it just never kind of works when you're talking about Bhutan, and it shows the limitations of how we measure this and how we talk about it, because Bhutanese can be quite print literate. Like, the way that the UN judges literacy is, can they understand a piece of written information in a given language? So what that doesn't measure is the penetration of literacy into the culture. So that Bhutan manages to be, and I think it's 63, so to be 37%, and even illiterate. Digital literacy, you know, farmers who might be functionally print illiterate can use emojis, send messages, swap videos, participate, WhatsApp, participate with a different level of digital literacy. So traditional language, so the other part of your question, is there interest in traditional language and culture? Very much, hugely. The Bhutanese are not so interested in having their culture diluted. They're actually it's a very dynamic culture that still is evolving and changing. You know, they've created a whole, you know, seshus, of these festivals that have been held, you know, since, I don't know, the 17th century. And they created a whole new one just a couple of years ago so that it's a tradition, but it's a living tradition and it's dynamic. So all of these can be continued on and through a forum like Zonka Wikipedia. So I spoke recently to a wonderful man called Dr. Karma Punso, who's a Oxford University alumni, and he runs something called the Loden Foundation. And he started on WhatsApp, or WeChat, WhatsApp I think, he started disseminating oral histories that he'd been recording. So his foundation had been going out into the rural areas and recording oral histories. And he started disseminating those in short bites that were the limitation of the platform to people in a particular group. And you can only have 500 in a circle. He ended up with 3 circles of Bhutanese, so 1,500 people who wanted him to be part of receiving these just small grabs of oral histories every day. And when I said to him, but you know, this is how Wikipedia might work for you, and Zonka Wikipedia, and you know, clearly there's an appetite for this amongst Bhutanese citizens, amongst the community. And this is what Wikipedia may be more helpful than sending little bits one after the other to 500 at a time.
Bunty, Margaret has asked, Margaret has said that she's just had a look for info on Wikipedia on Bhutan broadcasting. She's discovered a couple of pages. Are they different Wikipedia sites? Do they link sometimes from one to another?
I don't know. Are they different Wikipedia sites? Yes. Do they sometimes link from one to another? Yes and no. So, no. Yes, sometimes. My Wikipedia friends are looking at me with, that's what Wikidata does. Wikidata is this content where it will link information. It will provide categories for information so that you can link across to various Wikipedias. Oh, yes. So do terms in Zonka Wikipedia try to find the native word to refer to it, or do they use, this is again part of the tensions about Zonka within Bhutan, because concepts like the internet, well, clearly there's no Zonka word for that. So do they take the word English, the English word internet, or do they create their own word? Now, so far, Bhutanese have been deciding to create Zonka words, and they trace back through the etymology of the English word and then build back up to create a Zonka word that conveys the same essence. And the point of view is currently that it needs to be a non-English word for Zonka to remain a rich language within the country.
Bunty, I'm going to use Chair's privilege and ask you a question. Yours, I mean, as well, you and quite a few of our colleagues know, I'm a new Himalayan scholar as well, and also do a lot of ethnographic research, and your project has a very strong ethnographic research component. And I've definitely been answering a lot of these questions, so I would like to put the same to you. You outlined on one of your slides how the project has gotten delayed by the pandemic and what you will be aiming to do next year. So would you mind commenting on why you aren't pursuing this research in the interim solely online? What can you do in the meantime, and how will that inform your fieldwork when you get there?
Yeah, I don't think that you can, well, I don't think that I can do what I set out to do and what I sought funding to do and what I had discussed with the stakeholders and the various research partners. I don't think I can achieve that by doing it online. So to me, it seemed, you know, just a no-brainer that until I can physically go to Bhutan, I don't see how I can immerse myself in that to do it. But I do think that there's these communities of Bhutanese in Australia that I can pivot towards. But no, and when the lockdown happened and everyone was talking about sourdough and whatever, I thought, I'll learn Zonka. And then I realised, well, that's not going to work online. There aren't resources in Australia for me to learn Zonka, or online resources. But
thanks, Bunty. I'm just interested in how the pressure to pivot, how everyone has dealt with that. And some have gone like full digital methods online. Others have gone, what other things can we do? And others have gone, yeah, I can learn Zonka actually.
Yeah, no. Well, thank you. It's been very nice to have you all here. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Bunty. I think we will call it at 4 o'clock because it's Zoom. Yeah, it's much more intense, and we can't just go to the kitchen and have some drinks, unfortunately. I'm just going to put a link in the chat to our upcoming program. So all of our seminars are going to be online, and this format seems to work quite well. So if you would like to sit in on more of our seminars, please have a look at our program for the rest of the semester. And to RSVP, I'm not a big fan of the whole password thing, but I would prefer just to put it out there and then everyone can just join. But apparently there has been, Zoom crashing has been a big thing. So we are going to stick with the RSVP, and I'll provide the details beforehand. So thank you all so much. Let's all give some kind of indication. All of us who've got our screens on, some kind of visual indication that we really enjoyed Bunty's discussion. I'll clap really loudly and very quickly, so it's like a lot of us are doing it. And I very much hope to see you for our next seminar, which will be Mark Johnson speaking about careers in live gaming.